This is Christian Gomez with the New American Magazine, and on the show, we have a special guest today, the author of China RX, Rosemary Gibson. Rosemary, thank you for joining us today on the show.
Christian, it's really great to be with you. Thank you.
So I'm going to get started right into this. So on page 33 of your book, China RX, which was published in April of 2018, almost exactly 2 years ago from this date, you stated in the book on page 33, if a global public health crisis occurs, China will likely keep its domestically produced medicines at home and stockpile them to secure access for its citizens before seeing to the needs of other nations. And on page 38, you also stated, the truth is that America's dependence on a single nation for the active ingredients, raw materials, and chemical building blocks for so many essential medicines is a risk of epic proportions. Wow. How has that been reinforced, further reinforced with what's been happening recently with regards to the coronavirus and the actions of China?
Regrettably, Christian, it was prophetic. I had no idea that we'd be in this situation in such a short period of time, but it certainly is predictable. And what we have here now is centralization of the global supply for thousands of the core chemicals to make our prescription drugs in a country that had a pandemic of a disease and was shut down production. They shut down their transportation routes and they kept product for their own people. And now here we are. The world is dependent on a single country for the core chemicals to make the critical drugs that they need to treat people with coronavirus. There's more than 100 countries with people with this condition, and some of them are hospitalized. And those critical medicines were dependent on China. It's quite remarkable. And I
Yeah,
hope
so
it's a silver lining for all of this that we learn from it and begin to fix it.
on April 4th, the Indian government announced that it would be suspending all exports of the hydroxychloroquine, the malaria-fighting drug that's been proven quite effective in combating the coronavirus. That how does that further how does that further prove that our dependence on one country is just a disaster? And does China play a role in producing some of the ingredients used for India's production of the hydroxychloroquine that we need so badly here in America?
I'm hearing reports, Christian, yes, that India is obtaining the core chemicals for hydroxychloroquine from China. I'm also hearing reports that the hydroxychloroquine that we are getting from India, the President Trump and Prime Minister Modi reportedly had a conversation, and India has agreed to send hydroxychloroquine to the United States. I'm hearing reports that the core chemicals to make them depend on China. So this underscores not only all roads lead to China, and India has a huge generic drug industry, and nearly 70% of the core chemicals it needs for its people come from China.
So, in addition to the hydroxychloroquine that's needed to combat the coronavirus, what are some other key generic antibiotics and vitamins that the U.S. relies almost exclusively on communist China for? And how dependent have we become to communist China for our meds just in general?
Christian, the United States can no longer make the basic antibiotics that you need, that you give to your children for ear infections, that you take if you have bronchitis, or if you have pneumonia or strep throat, or if you're hospitalized with sepsis, which is a very serious condition that kills 27,000 people every year. We can't make those medicines. China is the dominant global producer. And it's not because China is cheaper with lower labor costs, it's because they formed cartels, they cheated, and they drove out their competitors. And then when they got global dominant market share, then they increased it for everybody. So they did it through illegal means of doing so. And some of these drugs, Christian, are critical medicines for people who are hospitalized with coronavirus, that we depend on China. It's really quite remarkable.
In the book, you mentioned penicillin, vitamin C, the ascorbic acid. That's the key essence of the vitamin C. and various other key drugs that we take for granted almost that come from communist China now. So how exactly did we get to this place where we've become so dependent? What led to the U.S. being the biggest manufacturer of meds in the mid to late 20th century to, I guess, at the end of the 20th century to now being dependent on China? What changed?
You're right. We can't make penicillin anymore, which will shock some people because right around World War II, before the invasion of Normandy, we had tremendous volume here, and that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. We can't make aspirin anymore. We can't make vitamin C anymore. Basic products that we need. These are medicinal products that are essential for life and health. And how did that happen? Well, when the United States opened up free trade with China, that's when we began to see the loss of the landslide, I call it. The landslide and the loss of manufacturing, because when we opened up free trade, the tariffs came off. So products from China became cheaper. And that's when China's cartel strategy took root, undercut everybody, and drove out their competitors. This is all illegal. This is anti-free market, what they did. This is not laissez-faire economics that was taking place. And it's that strategy. It's their industrial strategy to become the pharmacy to the world. And we're seeing the consequences of that now built up over 20, 25 years, where we're dependent. The world is dependent.
Absolutely. It's a form of economic and medical warfare, wouldn't you say, on the part of China?
Oh, this is what's called economic warfare. It's not your traditional warfare. And one of the most remarkable things that I learned while writing China RX, and this was a real clincher for me, and it's helpful for your viewers and listeners. I went up to a hearing on Capitol Hill, and this was at the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and there was a gentleman giving testimony about how China was targeting 20 advanced industries that are the future of our economy, and how it was engaging in all sorts of legal and illegal means to disrupt, dominate, and displace US-based companies. And the pharmaceutical industry is one of them. And this is the consequence of that very deliberate strategy, and it persists. So there's a plan here. This is not just because it's cheaper, but China has a plan to make the United States dependent on it for medicines. And when you control medicines, you control population. If you want to destabilize a country really quickly and demoralize people, all you have to do is withhold medicine. And China knows it.
Speaking of the U.S.-China Economic Security and Review Council, there was a clip that we have of Dr. Larry M. Wartzel, 8-term commissioner of that commission, and who also served for 32 years in the Army, retiring with the rank of a colonel in 1999. Let's listen to what he had to say about our meds coming from China.
The line of questions and responses just struck me, and I have to say I'm a military retiree. As a consequence, if I take regular prescriptions, I'm required to use express scripts. Yes, sir. They do a great job. In the past 3 months, I have had 4 blood pressure medications recalled. When I tracked down the sourcing, they all came out of India, but originally sourced in China. They're, from 4 different U.S. supposed manufacturers, at least providers, companies. In each case, that particular medication was contaminated with rocket fuel. If you did a little work on the internet, you could figure that out. So I know it's not your fault, but I think it's really important that something be done about this by the Department of Defense and the U.S. government in general. The other medication wasn't contaminated with rocket fuel, but again, 3 recalls in a 3-month period. I mean, I imagine active duty people have the same problem, and that affects the readiness of our force.
So, Rosemary, is this threat being taken seriously by our military, and just how bad is it?
It's very heartening to see that the U.S. military and the Defense Department is taking this threat very, very seriously because, as the retired Army colonel said, this affects the readiness of our troops. And also, I had the pleasure of testifying at that hearing, and I talked about how our medicines can be weaponized. They can be withheld. They can be contaminated with lethal contaminants. They can be sold without any active ingredient in them. And it's very insidious because by the time you figure it out, it can be too late.
Yeah,
Think of
it's
the men and women in the USS, Theodore Roosevelt, 24 of them were diagnosed with COVID-19, and the carrier had to go into port. And so those young men and women, if they're seriously ill, they'll depend on medicines from the adversary. So they are taking it very seriously. The question is, what's the response of Congress and frankly, the industry? Who's selling the Department of Defense defective medicines with rocket fuel? That's the question we should be asking.
Absolutely. So, in your book, you also mentioned that during World War II, like you mentioned earlier here in the interview, that right before D-Day, the U.S. manufactured close to 90% of the penicillin in the world, and that was shipped over to for the Allied troops to use. The American, British, and Canadian forces that landed on those beaches, saving countless lives. Now, if a similar situation were to happen in the South China Sea with Taiwan and in the mainland communist regime, would our U.S. forces even there, and the Taiwanese military probably also, have to rely on communist China for essential medications in the battlefield?
Because China controls the key ingredients for so many of these medicines, the answer is for a lot of them, yes. And China knows it. And we're
Wow.
just beginning to wake up. But still, the question is, who is supplying the Department of Defense with defective medicines that are being made by the adversary? And certainly the Department of Defense people don't want that. So how do we change it? And that's a lot harder than you would think.
So how is it that these contaminants are getting into these meds that are being manufactured in China, or at least the raw active ingredients? Like in your book, you mentioned the heparin that comes from basically comes from pigs when it's ultimately in its raw source. But how is it being contaminated in China, and how is it not being caught by the FDA here when it enters port?
Right. In the case of one of the blood pressure medicines mentioned by the Army colonel, there were whenever a drug goes off patent, there's a huge scramble to become the global leader for making that generic drug. And so in the case of the Chinese company, they wanted to find the cheapest way to make it. And so they came up with a new chemical process that actually did make it cheaper. But regrettably, they didn't assess what would happen if this were taken by humans. And they didn't look at the risks to human life. It's absolutely remarkable. And when the FDA finally got into the plant, they saw the company's records, and the company's records showed that they knew that their product did not meet federal standards, but they sold it anyway. And they sold it to people in more than 20 countries. And the amount of contaminant per pill in one of the blood pressure medicines called valsartan was 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. And people are taking this every single day. It's shocking. When you lose control over supply of our critical drugs, you lose control over quality. And just wait, we're also going to lose control over price, assuming we can even get them.
Now, when someone goes to the store like a Walmart or a Kmart, whatever, Target, and they purchase like a toy, let's say, it'll say on the bottom, made in China. But that's not always the case with our medicines, right? Even though the ingredients are coming from China. What's the story behind why, when you buy medicine, it doesn't often say that it's made in China?
About 13 years ago, there was a country of origin legislation proposed in Congress, and it was killed immediately. And while writing China RX, I asked someone in the industry, so why was it killed so quickly? And the response was, the companies probably thought it wouldn't be good for their business if their customers knew where their products were coming from. And what's even more remarkable is just in February of this year, the Department of Veterans Affairs was trying to fight special interests that wanted to further hide country of origin of the core ingredient. Under federal law previously, if your active ingredient was made in China and the finished drug was made here, it was still labeled made in China. But special interests have overturned that for now. And they say, so if you have a core chemical made in China for your drug and it's made in the US, you can still label it made in the US. And
Wow.
our military would be dependent on that.
And millions don't even know that's being made in some plant with deplorable lax regulations in communist China. Wow, that's amazing.
Well,
So,
one of the interesting things, Christian, is there's a chapter in China RX, Made in China, Sue in America, good luck. And it reveals the attitude there, which is one of the reasons our product is so cheap. It's cheap to the people who buy it, not necessarily to us, because there's a lot of people in between the manufacturer and when you pick it up at the drugstore. They say one of the reasons our product is we sell it so cheap to the big buyers in the US is because we assume no liability for it. It's buyer beware. Think of that.
it's extraordinary, and we thank you so much for writing this book and exposing what's going on. Finally, what are some recommendations or steps that you would recommend that Congress and those in the business community and the pharmaceutical industry also as well should be taking to bring the supply chain away from communist China and back domestically to the U.S.? What should we be doing?
Well, it's very heartening to see, Christian, that one of the first recommendations in China RX is to know who controls our drug supply. Prior to this time, it was nobody's job in the federal government to know that. But that is changing. And now there's we're scrambling. I mean, China knows exactly what it makes and where we're dependent. But now the federal government has a good sense of where we are most dependent for critical products. We need an ongoing capability to do that monitoring and to predict supply and demand, and where we have fragile supply chains or a sole supplier in China. Like we do this for oil, we do this for food. We track global food supply, we track global oil and other energy sources. We need to do the same thing with our critical medicines. And the industry has to agree to go along with this because there isn't a whole lot of interest on that side to pursue activities in the interest of our national security. That really needs to change. And I think we also need to support small companies here in the US that want to make medicines fully here in the United States. Not all of them, but some of them. So we have some minimum capability in the event of the next coronavirus or whatever happens, because something else will happen again without doubt. And we have a chance to be much better prepared than we are now.
Thank you so much. So, Rosemary, what are some websites that you have that people can go to learn more or to keep up to date with the latest information about our dependency on China when it comes to our medicines?
Sure. People can follow me on Twitter at Rosemary100. And the Amazon carries the Kindle version of China RX. We're trying to get new books in. The shutdown has had many ripple effects, so hopefully there'll be some new supply of hard copies of the book. But in the meantime, it's on Kindle, and I'm hearing also that people can get it at Barnes & Noble.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on the show. Take care, Rosemary. And, of course, thank you for bringing this information to our attention. God bless you and take care.